Alright, so now let's take a look at the global parameters. The first global parameter that's going to come up when we turn our power on is the playback mode. And let's real quick look through here. We've got all these different parameters that we're going to consider global parameters. And these parameters are going to affect all the different parts. And the parts we're going to consider as the trigger or the rhythm part, and CV1 and CV2 parts independently. So in the playback mode here, we can press our parameter encoder, and that's going to take us into this mode. And the parameter we can adjust with the knob is our sync type. In the internal mode, this device is going to start and stop playback by itself and use its own internal clock and tempo settings. In external mode, it's going to use the external analog clock plugged into our clock input here. We would need to set up our jumpers on the back so that this clock jack is an actual input instead of an output. The third option is MIDI, which means the device is going to sync to MIDI clock or act as a slave device. And you'll notice in our situation, we've got this device acting as our master. It is set up to sync to its own internal clock. And then these three slave devices are set to sync to MIDI. So our master device is sending MIDI clock onto these three slaves, and it's doing that over the power bus by sending MIDI information back and forth. When we're in internal mode here, we can press the tap key, and you can see playback has begun, and you've got a visual indication here with the LED blinking at quarter note intervals, acting as more of a visual metronome. We can stop playback, and when you're in MIDI sync, you're not going to have really any function of this. If we were to be in external sync and press the tap key, what that'll do is it'll manually reset our count for the sequence back to the first step. And we could also be doing that while we are syncing or receiving clock if we want to throw off the timing a little bit, or maybe realign the timing so that it is on beat. I'm going to leave this to MIDI for now, so all of our slaves are the same. So now we've got all these other things. I think what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to program something into here so we can see just how these global parameters will affect the patterns that we've got playing. So let's go up here. I'm going to start our playback. And actually I'm going to stop it real quick. And the first thing I'm going to show you is that whenever we are stopped playback, and we could be in, let's say, the rhythm mode, or we could be in CV1 mode, or CV2 mode, we can create manual triggers, which is nice. You know, sometimes you just want to play something live and trigger it and send a specific CV or two out. So the way this is going to work is this is our value that we are going to temporarily generate for CV1. And every time I tap the tap switch, you're going to play that instrument. If we're playing and pressing this tap switch, it's going to automatically quantize our taps to the nearest clock. So let me program in a little pattern here. I'm going to start this, and I'm just going to listen to the sounds. I'm previewing it. I'm basically generating a fill here by holding down the tap switch just to preview what samples I've got to work with. Okay, so there's a kick drum. Now let's go get a snare. Now maybe some hi-hats. Alright, so we got a basic little pattern going on there. Let's go back to our... Actually, I'm going to add just a little bit more to that, so it's not just eighth note stuff. Alright, so now I've created just a little pattern in this TRAX so we have something to listen to while we're looking at these global parameters. I'm going to start playback. And now let's take a look at the other global parameters. So we've got tempo here, and the way this works is we can press the encoder and have access to the beats per minute. We can change beats per minute all the way from 10 beats per minute up to 250 beats per minute. We can manually bump that tempo up and down using the negative and plus keys. Or we could use the tap button to enter in our tempo by tapping twice. And there I've just half timed it. If I want to double time, well, pretty close. Slow it back down a little bit. But that's an easy way if you're trying to beat match something else that's not synced up. You could just tap the tempo in and get really close that way. Then you may have to make some fine adjustments using the up-down keys. So that's our tempo. Our swing amount is has a range of 50% all the way up to 75%. Now you're not hearing much effect there because most of what's programmed into our pattern is just eighth notes. So let's go ahead and fill this pattern full of hi-hats. And we can go down to the rhythm part and see there's not that much in there. I'm going to go ahead and hold this down so we get a constant 16th note pattern. Let's go back up here. And the reason why we don't hear any shuffling happen is because this swing amount, even though this is the master device, has no effect on this unit here. So each swing is built into its own unit. So if we want to hear swing on this, let's go down here, go up to swing, and now increase the swing amount. And you'll see that swing amount value can range from 50% to 75%. We'll use the encoder here to make our selection, or if we'd like to make a selection more quickly, these little keys here all have a specific value programmed into them. So the tap key will default us to the 50% value. The negative key will jump us to the 66% value. And then the plus key will activate a 75% swing. If we want to clear it out, just press the tap key, and now we're back to a swing amount of 50%. That's a quick way to get to the high end or the low end or right in the middle when you're making adjustments. Here we've got our time signature, and let's look at the different time signatures that are available. I'm going to stop playback here. So the different time signatures that are available are going to be 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, 6/4, and 8/4. And you'll notice that I can select any one of these time signatures using the parameter encoder. And let's say we are at 4/4 because that's what it's going to default to. Often you'll find that you don't want to mistakenly jump from 4/4 to 3/4 because it's a rather different feel. So let's say you're in 4/4 time signature and you want a half time. All you need to do is press the negative key, and now you're going to jump to 2/4, which is going to half time our pattern, or we could jump to 1/4. Going the other way, we can hit the plus key and jump from 1/4 to 2/4, 2/4 to 4/4, or 4/4 to 8/4. Now let's say we're in 4/4 and we want to jump to that 3/4 time signature. We can hit the tap key, and that bumps us into the 3/4 time signature. And now the negative key does nothing because there's no time signature that is exactly half of 3/4. However, 6/4 is going to be double time 3/4. So we can jump between 3/4 and 6/4 just using the plus and minus keys. Now let's say we're in 3/4, we can hit the tap key and again jump back to 3/4. And so that allows us to use these as more as double time, half time switches without accidentally getting into a time signature that feels quite a bit different. Even when we're in 6/4, we can press this and jump to 8/4, which is our double time for 3/4 or 4/4. And so let's go ahead and set this back to 4/4. The other thing I'll mention is that when you make adjustments to the time signature, the new time signature setting will update at the next bar break within your pattern, and that should keep everything musical. Alright, so I've changed up our pattern here in this TRAX unit just to show you a little bit better example of the mute function. So the first thing I'm going to do is activate that mute. And I'm going to start playback here. The plus key is going to turn our mute off and on. So when we turn it on, we don't hear any output because our trigger outputs and our CV outputs have stopped updating. Press it again to unmute. The negative key is going to act as a temporary mute. So as long as we hold that down, our audio output or our trigger's output signals will stop. I'm going to turn mute back on and show you our third button here. The tap button is going to allow us to temporarily throw sounds in, even if they're not programmed onto the step. And that's all defined by the fill parameter values. If I hold it down, I'm now hearing all the notes. Unmute. Temporary mute. So that's our mute function. Here is our fill type. So in that mute mode, we are using the tap button to actually generate a fill. And we can also generate fills while we are in the rhythm mode, CV1 mode, or the CV2 mode. So let's look at the fill types here. We're going to press the encoder to access these values. And our default value is all steps. What that means is when we create a fill, it's going to fill at the fastest clock rate possible for whatever time signature we've got selected. So in 4/4, we're going to be filling at a 16th note interval. Let's say we had a time signature of 8/4, we would then be filling at a 32nd note interval. All steps, whenever we hit this, we can temporarily throw a fill in to any step we like. If we select the on steps only, it will only produce a fill when the tap button is held down and steps have been programmed on within our rhythm part here. So in this case, all the steps are turned on, so it's still going to play every possible clock that we've got. Let's say we set it to off steps. What that's going to do is produce a fill only on the steps that are programmed as off or 0 or empty in our rhythm part here. And then you've got no fill. And no fill just means that all the modes that can generate a fill by pressing the tap key, it'll prevent that fill from occurring. It's just a little safety measure that's there. Let's start our playback. And let's edit the rhythm pattern a little bit so not all the steps are on. So there we've got an odd pattern. And we've got all steps selected. Let's go up to our CV part. Our CV part is determining what sample is going to play at any time. So let's select a different sample here. There we've got a snare drum. So as long as I hold down the tap key, we're getting a 16th note fill. I could tap it in when I want the snare to occur. So that allows us to kind of create a temporary change in our program pattern without actually affecting our pattern. Now let's go back here and let's change our fill type to only on steps. And let's start playback and go back up to our CV part. So now when I hold this down, Okay, gotta activate it. Now when I hold this down, that snare is only playing on the steps we've got programmed into the rhythm is on. And we could select different samples. Now let's go ahead and change that to off steps and go back up here to our CV part, start playback, and let's activate it. So there you can hear that it's only allowing us to play that filled part in the steps that are programmed as a dark circle here or being off. And that's going to give you a lot of different techniques that you can use. The off steps is really nice when you want to preserve the sound and feel of the original pattern, but you want to add stuff into it. Let's say you've got a basic kick and snare pattern going, and you've got a lot of empty steps there. You could select, let's say, a hi-hat sound or some other percussive sound and be doing a fill just on the off step. So now all of our steps are being filled or played, but the steps we program in are playing as they've been programmed, and the notes that we're filling are just filling live however we choose, if we're selecting different samples or what. Let's go back down here and look at the next parameter. So here we've got record steps, and the possibilities are CV1, CV2, CV1 and 2, or the rhythm. The next feature in our global parameter values is the CV1 range. The CV1 range value is going to limit the range we can access with our CV parts. Let's go up here and we'll see CV1. This is our value to write. It starts at 0 and goes all the way up to 63. So let's go back down here to our CV range, and we'll notice the values here range from 1 to 64. So if we leave it at 64, we can generate all 64 values within our CV part. But let's say we want to work only with an octave's worth of values here. So if we set the CV1 range to 12 values, let's go up here. Now we'll see we can range from 0 to 11. Obviously, you've got 1 through 11 plus 1 being 0 gives us 12 values. And the reason why this is nice is, let's say that you are automatically regenerating some of these CV parts, either using the evolve, the phi, or the randomize features. It will restrain the value outcomes to this range here, whatever we've set. So if it's 12, it'll pick a value from 0 through 11. And the other thing I should mention is, let's say you've already programmed in value ranges from 0 to 63 or whatever in your CV part. As you decrease this values parameter, it's going to act like a little compressor for those values. So if you had values, let's say at 63, and now you start to bring it down here, it's going to bring those values that are above this point down to this point. And it can be used as a type of performance feature to where you're basically compressing everything down to, let's say, a value of 1 or our base value. And then after that's done, we can re-increase our value to gain full access for the full range. Here you've got CV1 scale. These are musical scales, and there are 29, I believe, in all, yes. And so, even though they're given a number, you've also shown the name here. And what these scales are going to do is they are going to apply a quantization to our actual CV outputs. And it'll also affect our MIDI output for notes that we're sending. And You can turn the encoder here to select them. You can use the up-down keys to select them. Wherever you are, you can always press the tab key, and that'll jump you back to 0 or default you to the chromatic scale. Similar for CV1, you also have a CV2 range. Again, its value can range from 1 to 64. CV1 and CV2 also have their own independent scales. That works just like CV1. And here we have our master loop feature. The master loop feature was created to help keep everything in sync. Let's say, for instance, that you've got your rhythm part, your CV1 part, and your CV2 part. They all have their own individual loop points and offsets and all these things. And there's a chance that if you were adjusting, let's say, the loop point from 3 steps to 5 steps to then jump to 16 steps and all, that part's loop may get out of sync with what the rhythm part's doing or whatever. So we've created this master loop, and by default, it's going to be off. That means nothing. It's not going to have any effect. The bars value here can range from 1 to 64 bars. And what that's going to do is when we reach, let's say, 1 bar, it'll cause our loop points for all the different parts, being the rhythm, the CV1 part, and CV2, to all resync and start from the first step again. And we could set that to 2 bars, 3 bars, 4 bars, whatever. The other thing you can do here is by pressing the plus key, you'll notice that you're not only increasing and decreasing it, but you're doing so, you're making adjustments in musical values. So to jump from 1 bar to 2 bar to 4 bars to 8 bars to 16 to 32 and 64, because that's most likely the musical division that you're going to want everything to resync up to. If you want specific value like 7 bars or 6 bars, you can make fine adjustments with the encoder value here. And then when you press the tab key, it's not going to default your value. However, what it will do is cause everything to reset and resync. This can also be useful as kind of a restart from the beginning of the sequence if you want to do kind of a stuttering or repeating effect of the sequence. And the other thing that it will do is when we manually force a reset here, it will generate a reset at our clock output. So it'll be resetting the counters or the sequencers or whatever is following us through our analog clock output here. Next, we move on to the MIDI global parameter function. And you'll notice that this is going to default to no, which means that MIDI channel it's not going to generate any MIDI channel here. Again, we can adjust with the encoder. We can use the up-down keys to make minute adjustments. If we press the tab key, it's going to default us back to that no state, which means no MIDI is going to be sent out. To take advantage of MIDI within the TRAX, you're going to need the optional MIDI bus MIDI interface, which is basically a breakout for the MIDI signals being carried over the power bus. It'll bring it over here, buffer it, opto-isolate it, and then output it to the 3.5 millimeter MIDI jacks. The other thing I'd like to talk about with the MIDI channel, and something that's cool to the TRAX, is unlike other devices, you are free to change this MIDI channel on the fly while the pattern is playing, and it'll redirect out that MIDI information to whatever channel is currently selected. And it'll do so without creating any type of note hang-ups or whatever in the device that you are controlling, which is really nice. And you'll notice here, once we get past MIDI channel 16, we then enter a MIDI to CV converter mode. This mode is only accessible, I believe, when the sequencer is stopped, just to prevent you from changing modes accidentally. Here you've got channels 1 through 16 as well. And what that's going to do is it's going to define the MIDI channel that we are now looking at coming from our MIDI bus. And it's going to convert that MIDI information into appropriate trigger, CV, and CV1 and CV2 signals. So the trigger signal is going to be generated based on when we receive a note on from MIDI. The pitch of that MIDI note that we receive will be converted to CV1, and the velocity of that MIDI note will be converted to CV2 output. One of the nice things about having MIDI and these specific MIDI functions within the TRAX is that this allows us, let's say we set this up to MIDI channel 1, and we start playback and we're generating all this MIDI information, we're spitting it out. We could be recording all that MIDI information of our performance into our favorite DAW workstation. Then we could take those tracks. We could record multiple takes if we like. We could even record up to 16 different tracks, assign each one of those takes to a specific MIDI channel, let's say 1 through 16 in our DAW, then come back here and set this to MIDI to CV converter mode. And by simply selecting different MIDI channels, we could be selecting which one of those 16 different tracks in our DAW that we're going to be converting and being used to play whatever device we've got hooked up at any time. That's a really cool feature, and it's also a nice way that we can back up information. We can record our MIDI sequences into the computer, further edit them if we like, save them, or reapply them to other devices within our DAW, or send that MIDI back out to any other MIDI module we'd like to control. Our next parameter is the MIDI offset function. So MIDI offset is basically going to define our base MIDI note. Since our CV value range can be from 0 to 63, and MIDI has about a 10 octave range, that 0 through 63 range is only going to cover about 5 of those octaves. So the MIDI offset here allows us to adjust which portion of the roughly 10 octaves of MIDI spec are we going to be controlling and playing our 5 octaves. By default, we've got an offset value of 36. That's going to be a C note. And we can go all the way up to 64. So 0 through 64, with 36 roughly being in the middle. And you'll notice there as I make adjustments here and hit the tap key, that defaults us right back to that base value of 36. And that's really nice when you're playing a sequence. You could kind of use this as a transpose function to do a temporary transpose, hit the tap button, and you're going to be right back to playing in the key that you started with. And our final global parameter value here is the sleep mode. You can see these other devices have gone to sleep because we're not using them. This is basically a screensaver mode, so that if you're the type of person who likes to leave your system on for hours and hours every day, if you were to just leave it on with certain text being displayed like that, over time, over months, over years, or whatever, the backlight is going to weaken, and you're going to start seeing whatever you've been displaying all the time appear to be more dim. So this sleep mode, we can set it to 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, or turn it completely off, which means it will never enter the screen mode. And you might want to do that if you're in performing or whatever and you don't want something to go to sleep. But you'll notice that anytime a device does go to sleep like this, you can just hit a button and it'll wake it up without actually activating the function, whatever you've got selected for that. By default, it's just going to be 5 minutes. That means after 5 minutes of inactivity, the unit's going to turn on and produce that geometric pattern we saw there. And that basically concludes all the global parameters. There are more menus here. So we start getting into the rhythm part, then the CV1 part, and then CV2 part. And you'll notice that this is quite a bit of menus, and you're thinking, well, that's a lot to keep track of. So we built in a quick navigation to this menu system, so you don't have to use just this encoder to jump around. So let's start in the global parameter mode. If we hit the plus key, it jumps us right into the rhythm part. Hit it again. Now we're at the beginning of the CV1 part. Hit it again. We're at CV2 part. And we could continue to keep pressing this button and it'll just keep cycling us through the rhythm, CV1 and CV2 parts. However, let's say we're at the rhythm part, and now we navigate negatively with the negative key. That's going to drop us back down into the global parameter modes, and it's going to do a couple things. It's intelligent in a way, so let's jump back up here. So right here we're at rhythm A, there's rhythm B, and it doesn't matter which one of those we're on. If we hit the negative key, it's going to jump us down to the fill type. And that is because when we are in rhythm A, rhythm B, CV1, CV2, A or B, we are able to produce our fills in those modes. And so when you get back into the global mode, the most likely thing that you're going to want to edit is the fill type. And that's why it jumps you down into that parameter value. If we go past those modes, and let's say we're at the remix or whatever for the rhythm, and we drop back down into the global parameter modes, then it's going to automatically select CV links. So when we're at any other parameters besides the actual rhythm parts, will be brought into the CV links first, because it's most likely that you might want to make some adjustments to what if that parameter is being linked to the rhythm part or not. And so once we are in this global mode, it doesn't matter where we are. Let's say we're a MIDI channel. If we hit the negative key, it drops us all the way back, brings us all the way to the beginning of our global parameter. So we could be at CV2 range, and we're back here. Similarly, we could be at any portion of these global parameter values, and if we hit the plus key, again, it brings us right into the first function of the rhythm mode. And again, we could cycle through that, and we could be at anything. Let's say we are adjusting the remix value for CV1 here, and let's say we make an adjustment. We want to set that to 38. And now we want to make an adjustment to CV2. We just hit the plus key and it cycles us through to the same parameter value. Or if we select a different, let's say we're working on the loop points, we can cycle this through, work on the loop point for rhythm 1, CV1, or CV2. And that's the fastest way to navigate this unit. I mean, within basically a couple button presses, you're really right there where you want to be. And it'll make your life a lot easier if you start learning these little shortcuts.